Dear guests, I have a distinct pleasure today to preside over this wonderful event. We have been waiting for a long time for this book to appear. And so we're here to celebrate its publication and the author, our dear colleague Lynn Garafola, who has been part of the Columbia Barnard Harriman community for a long time. It is an added pleasure for me to introduce Lynn's book tonight because we share something. We were not at the same time, but consecutively fellows at the Coleman Center and the New York Public Library. So it is also, in a way, a Coleman publication, which we love to celebrate additionally.
And we have a few Coleman graduates here, Elizabeth Kendall and Marco Jefferson.
No, I was never a Coleman.
I was not a Coleman date.
I never applied, but I also never applied to these.
You should have been.
Well, Elizabeth Kendall was a Coleman as well.
So
Thank you, Lynn. Don't fancy on those resumes.
Lynn, in this audience, doesn't need any introduction, but I will say that she has taught, researched, and inspired dance for several decades in our community. And one of the special things for me about this book is that the protagonist is not only a woman of remarkable achievement, but also a transnational figure of the emigre community that emerged from the disintegrated Russian Empire. And like many creative personalities from her generation, she represents this incredible leaven that enriched European and North American culture and Latin American and Asian cultures. So in a way, this book is also a celebration of the power of the emigre community to contribute to the host countries in surprising and admirable ways, which I believe in this particular moment is something worth remembering. Yes. So Lynn, I will give the floor to you for.
Well, I would like to say that appreciating Nijinska within the context of this transnational community was something that I learned. This was not, I had worked on the Ballet Russe, but in some measure, the Ballet Russe is so often seen as beginning in Russia, then sort of in Paris, in Monte Carlo, in London, then not so much in New York, New York or the US, and one sees it in that light. And then, but somehow when I began researching this, one, I had no idea of the magnitude of her travels, to what extent she had had so much importance, she had played such an important role in the professionalization and Russification of ballet in Argentina, for instance. That to me was an entire story that was fascinating, but totally unexpected. And another aspect was her life, even within Europe, you know, the fact that she didn't necessarily work for the dominant companies of the time, but rather she had her own companies, which were primarily Russian children of Russian emigres, but not necessarily so, that she had companies that were in Britain, that she had companies in Paris, but they toured to other places, that she spent almost a year in Poland, working with something that was called the Polish Ballet or Polish National Ballet. And then of course she had her whole US career. there were times I felt, okay, another year, another 2 years, and where do we go now? Now it's Poland. Oh, now it's New York City. Now it's Jacob's Pillow. Now it's Monte Carlo. And that I mean, this is one reason why so little of her work has remained. But the other thing that then is so interesting in this transnational pattern, that she was able to get along speaking Russian or French, because there were theater people throughout Europe, these Russian emigre theater producers, impresarios, conductors, musicians, of course, ballet teachers, accountants throughout this entire route. She even found Russian, lawyers in Paris, later on, but they all turned out to be, when I began, who is Monsieur Crémet? Well, Monsieur Crémet was actually a Russian emigre who had settled in France and become a maître there. So this, this far-flung world was something that, this far-flung world and career was something that was really new. And then, of course, it posed certain questions about nationality. And I think this is something that I think about over and over in these last this last month. What did it mean for her to be, quote, Russian? She was a Russian dancer. She was a Russian choreographer. Her writings are in Russian. All her individual, her numerous diaries and the drafts of letters that she might ultimately write in French was this was all in Russian. Yet she is born of Polish. She's of Polish descent. She is born in Belarus, in Minsk. Her brother, who is also of Polish descent, is born in Kiev. Another brother is born in Tbilisi, in other words, in Georgia. The early life of her family, when she was very, very young, they were all over Southern and Western Europe. They go and visit a friend who is in what is now Lithuania. They go and visit someone else who's in. She feels when she's in Poland in the late 1930s, she goes to this former Romanov hunting lodge in what was then Eastern Poland. It's now, I think, part of Belarus. And she says, Russian village, this is my house, good my soul feels here. This is in 1938, that she feels this sense of being back in Russia. She never does go back to Russia. But then what does it mean in terms of her own identity? And she keeps talking about Kiev as, even at times there's slippage between this is my city. When you would normally think that St. Petersburg, where she went to the Imperial Theater School and lived from the time she was about 5 until until 1915, that, except when she was on tour with the Ballet Russe, this would have been her, this would have been her city. But Kiev also left this really important mark on her life, and of course on her artistic creation, because she happened to be there during the period of the Ukrainian Revolution, which dovetailed with the February Revolution, and which was a moment of great creative ferment with painters and theater directors. It was sort of a multicultural, multilinguistic moment. She worked with studios, the Jewish studio. She worked with the Ukrainian theater linked to Les Curvas. And, and I think there was also an opera studio that she worked with, but I was never able to find very much about that. And she had her own studio, which she called the School of Movement, not the School of Ballet, but a School of Movement. And from the names of her students, it's clear some were Polish, some were Jewish. They represented, one might say, that multicultural moment in Kiev, in Ukraine itself. So what was she? Was she Russian? Was she a Sovietized Russian? I mean, there were some among the emigres who thought that she was fairly, that she was too friendly, had been too influenced by that Soviet moment that she had spent in Kiev, because she hadn't left in 1921. And moreover, she had worked there and had a studio there. When she became part of the immigration, she kept her distance from some people, but of course she's very much a part of the, of the immigration. And then she comes to the United States, and because of her family, settles in California. I mean, they wanted to stay in Southern California. She did not want to stay in Southern California. So I think this notion of what her identity was, who she was Russian, she becomes an American citizen. She, for years, had a stateless passport. What I could never understand is when she left Kiev in 1921, she went across the Polish border. And since she had, because she had been baptized in Warsaw, the parents had taken all the kids back to Warsaw to be baptized. She had the right to Polish nationality. So she was able to get a Polish passport very, very quickly, which gave her entree to to Western Europe. However, after a time, she gave up the Polish passport, and she had one of these. She had a Nansen passport, and hers, since she traveled so much, was enormous. It was like this accordion that went from here over to there, where they're sitting. It was that look. Why she traded that, I have no idea. But there again, you sense that she's identifying with this tribe that in a sense is this stateless tribe of Russian speakers.
The cultural nomads.
The cultural nomads, that's a very good phrase.
So how did you come across this project? How did the Nijinska mesmerize you for so many years?
Well, I became fascinated with her when I was working on the Ballet Russe, which was the subject of my first book. But no one really, I wrote about her ballets in that book, but no one really seemed to know much about her, except that she was Nijinsky's sister. She had this name recognition, but she was Nijinsky's sister. Then she would leave, and she left the Ballet Russe when he left. She came back, choreographed for Diaghilev, and then left again. But what happened after that? No one really knew. Then she turned up in the US during World War II with so many other Russian emigres entering, you might say, their second diaspora. But I didn't really know very much. Occasionally I would read some things that were not very flattering, or I would read certain things where she should have been and she wasn't. For instance, there was this very influential book called Balletomania. It was published in the 1930s by Arnold Haskell. And it has something, this was a book designed to introduce ballet to a growing English ballet audience, many of whom didn't really know very much about ballet. So this was intended to instruct them. So there was a chapter called For Choreographers. So this was to introduce them to the choreographers of the Ballet Russe, Michel Fokine, Vaslav Nijinsky, Leonid Massine, George Balanchine. There were interviews with all of them except for Nijinsky, because he was in a sanatorium. He had been schizophrenic since the late 1910s. But there's no interview with Nijinska. There's a whole section about her brother, but there was nothing in that chapter about her. There were things in other chapters having to do with her ability to teach male dancers, having to do, it was really also some things about her physical looks, that she was the only ugly dancer to find fame. Yes, I know, there were phrases like this, but in the crucial chapter about her being a choreographer, there's nothing. And it's when I began seeing things like that, that I was quite fast. Remember, this is in a moment that comes in the aftermath of second wave feminism. So one became alert to some of these silences or other things. The other thing that fascinated me was there was an exhibition, which some of you here remember, of which took place at the Cooper Hewitt Museum. The first time that that material from Nijinska's own collection, she by then was dead, was ever put on display. And it was a remarkable exhibition because no one really knew anything about her small companies, and there were extraordinary designs by Alexandra Exter. There were costumes, there were all kinds of letters, there were a lot of diagrams and her Nijinska's own notations about various ballets so she could revive them. And one wondered, and then I worked with the curator, Nancy Van Norman Baer, helped her with the catalog as a kind of historical consultant. And her source of information was Nijinska's daughter, Irina Nijinska. And there was a chapter, there were some sections about what happened in Russia during World War I and the period afterwards. And there were some hints that there was something going on that had to do with with Soviet experiments. And then to see these Alexandra Exter designs, which were so clearly modernist, that became very fascinating to me. What happened there? And of course, her daughter didn't really know much about it, and she kept using French terms. So we all thought that the School of Movement, which really had a Russian title, School of Movement, was the École de Mouvement, which would, of course, sound very, very different if you were hearing it, seeing it in a Russian or a Ukrainian context. And that, again, what happened during those years? And that's really the first chapter I wrote, an earlier version of the chapter, which I had then published, because that to me, if I never got through the rest of the book, I had to get that on paper, because that was about her transformation and about an attempt to suggest to a dance audience some of the, this jubilant modernism, as Irina Makarik and Verlana Kach wrote in their study of this particular moment within Kiev modernism of the late 1910s and the 1920s. And that was something that really brought me to Kiev, or Kiev as we call it. And
I have tons of other questions, but I want to turn the mic to the audience, and I'm sure you are bursting with things to ask or comment.
You mentioned her dance notations. Did she use a variety are there a variety of different sources of her notations and types of notation?
I think there are different types of notations. Some of them are typical of ballet notations in that they're indicating, like there'll be a circle and then with an arrow, like people are supposed to go in that direction or people in that direction, or how people are lined up. And that's fairly conventional. And sometimes there'll be step names written out. Some of them are more conceptual. Some of them are written on scores. Most of them seem to be written. They're not written in any standard style. So they're not Binesh or Laba notation. They're not the Stepanov notation. Although once in a while there'll be a little hint of that, because she, like all the other students at the Imperial Theaters in the 1910s, had to study this Stepanov system, which her brother used to record some things, most notably Afternoon of Buffon, but she really didn't use it that much. I think probably because she was always choreographing under great pressure. And therefore, there wasn't time to record something. I believe that she recorded things when she, maybe afterwards, definitely, but possibly when she was preparing herself to restage something.
So it's really hard for a biographer when the most known accomplishments of the subject came relatively early in their life.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to ask you a sort of two-pronged question. I've been so lucky to follow along on some of the developments in Lynn's writing the book. So I wanted to ask you how you coped with a kind of period in the US that seemed to be full of setbacks and sorrows. And also I wanted you to talk about Buffalo that you discovered so late, which is sort of a burst of hope at the end of the book, if I remember right.
Yes, it is a sort of burst of hope at the end of the book because she encountered once again a very young group of students, students of a former dancer of hers, Kathleen Crofton, who had been in her company in the 1930s. And at a time when Balanchine and his orientation to ballet, his technique, if you will, had become increasingly influential within the US, Crofton really believed in Russian technique. She had studied with a number of Russian teachers. She had taught in London very successfully a lot of dancers from the Royal Ballet and others. So she believed in a kind of synthesis of more traditional Russian technique and even some Soviet technique. But she believed in Russian technique. So I think Nijinska felt she was in good hands, that her students were very, very devoted. Some of them told me that they used to practice the choreography themselves after a rehearsal, usually. People say enough is enough, but no, they were incredibly devoted to her. Also, she gave them a tremendous, I think, sense of professionalism.
What years are
We're talking about 68, 69, 70, very late at the end, really at the end of her life. But she was very alive to all of them. They remembered her amazingly clearly. I interviewed many of them. I got long emails from some of them, more than I needed. But one of them told this wonderful story about how Nijinska was always trying to get people to use their abdominals, even though she didn't call them abs or anything, but she wanted, and breath was the other thing, and the back. And she, this one dancer who was sort of lankier, and she said, "Now punch me here, so you can." Now you have to understand she's nearly 80 years old. So this 16-year-old was a little loath to do it. And so Nijinska really insisted, and when she insisted, you did what she did. And her muscles were like steel. So she, even though at that point she could barely walk because she had had this, I think it was phlebitis, and she was not in the greatest shape. But nevertheless, her abdominals, I don't know how she did it, but she insisted upon that. She rehearsed individually with many of them. She rehearsed Petrushka, the ballerina material, with one of the dancers who remembered it vividly. She rehearsed her version of Aurora's Wedding with multiple fairies and with the different names and whatever, and rehearsed individually with all of them. She also did Chopin Concerto, which I still believe is a work that could come back, or at least a piece of it could be recovered. And I think that was one of her, it's sort of tragic that was lost in the, it was originally choreographed for the Polish ballet, was virtually abstract, or if you, it was abstract, and it was, then she kept trying to keep it in repertory. So it was in repertoire, it was performed at the Hollywood Bowl with Sid Charisse and the Tallchief sisters, and others. And then it was performed she said it on the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo with Maria Tallchief in one of the roles. She loved Maria Tallchief, very strong. I think she sensed the toughness in her. She then said it on the Marquis de Cuevas company in Paris, and then finally in that I just wish that Frederick Ashton had asked her to do it for the Royal Ballet in the 1960s, because then it would have stayed in repertory. It would have, because she believed that Kathleen Crofton's company was going to go on to greater and greater things, but unfortunately after 2 years or 3 years, it folded. And then Crofton went on to another company, the Maryland Ballet, and she never did another work of Nijinskas. So there was yet another one of those things. But how did I deal with World War II? One of my feelings about World War II is the worst thing she could have done was listen to her husband and her daughter and gone to California. The ostensible thing was that there were fewer ballet teachers in Southern California, whereas in New York, the New York metropolitan area, it was swimming in Russian ballet teachers. But her husband and her daughter really felt that Southern California was great. And her school did generate income, and she, it was a successful school. But she kept losing jobs for that, for that reason. So if something had to be revived, or for instance, summers at Jacob's Pillow, she did one summer, and Ted Shawn wanted her back the second summer. And the idea of Ted Shawn and Bronislava Nijinska are really two quite different. I mean, until I read some of Shawn's letters to a correspondent describing the chaos that went on at Jacob's Pillow, I would never have believed that they actually got on in some way, shape, or form. But they did. And he wanted her back the following summer, but she was out in California and he couldn't pay for her and someone else and her husband who always accompanied her. So that's where I feel she remains then on the periphery even of the New York ballet world, which in itself was shifting. On the one hand, nationalism is very strong. There had been the American Ballet Theater, which was just called Ballet Theater then, was a strongly national company, even though they had Russians, i.e. emigres, and some English.
Huron sat on the American part during the war, and then they got away from him.
And then they got away from him. And then there were other Russians like Fokin, who of course were honorary New Yorkers he had settled in New York in 1919, and by 1940 he's an honorary New Yorker. He's not just off the boat the way Nijinska literally was. There's Balanchine, who had arrived in 1933. His acculturation process was very, very rapid, and by the war he's very well known, mainly both as a ballet choreographer, but especially as a choreographer for Broadway and also for Hollywood. So he's very much on the scene as well. And there are certainly times, as we both know, when he kind of dumped Nijinska. The first thing to go, she had a Bach ballet they were dancing, another one of her abstract ballets, and he did that. In the next year, and then a few months later, they're doing his Bach ballet, which is one I love very dearly, but I'm very sorry that killed Nijinska's. He starts trimming away at Chopin Concerto, which I guess he didn't feel he could just dump like that. Getting rid of some of the men for some reason, and there are letters where Nijinska writes to Denham, why are you letting this happen? There should be X number of men. And that's how it was choreographed and how it was always performed. So, there are all of these other things that are going. But then again, she was not physically present. And I think had she been physically present teaching at schools in New York City, she would have had more of a base and a greater presence, through her students, through just being there, etc. And there were a couple of times I found she and her husband had actually bought land in New York, in the New York area. There was one, once was up in Riverdale at a time this must have been in the 1940s, early 40s, when Riverdale was still not exactly rural, but it didn't have much of the building that you see there now. And they just bought, I assume she was thinking of, this would be a very nice place to have a house and be able to come, into New York. There's a railroad. And then another time was up in Upper Westchester County. Eric, what county?
Salem.
North Salem. It's this beautiful, beautiful town. It still is very rustic looking, and certainly it would be dacha country. And so it's clear that she wanted to set down roots. It's also clear from some letters that survived that she wrote to this friend of hers, a very close friend of hers, who had been a student of hers in Kiev and then had emigrated. They were friends in Paris, and she the friend moved to the Upper West Side, not very far from here, and Nijinska went to California. And then, so Nijinska would write her letters like, it would be so wonderful if you would come and visit. The weather's wonderful. It never rains. It's sunny all the time. Of course, I don't really know anyone here, and it's, it says, but the school is doing well, and the weather is fantastic. So, she clearly had mixed feelings.
We have two questions from our online audience. The first question comes from Katrina Ferrugia Creel.
Mhm.
And the question is, what was the biggest challenge and highlight in writing this book?
The biggest challenge was integrating, I think, the factual material, or a lot of the reviews, the documentation with the larger narrative of her life. Because since so little was known about her life, about her career, it was extremely important to document that as much as I could. And thanks to the much wider availability now of French newspapers of the interwar period, it was possible to follow a number of, to document a number of her works, and to see how, some people couldn't stand them, some people liked them, some people dismissed them. By the mid-1930s, some of the real French nationalism that's coming out vis-a-vis these Russian works, et cetera, et cetera. So integrating that and keeping the narrative moving was, I think, probably the hardest thing to do.
Thank
The
you.
highlight?
And the highlight?
The highlight. The highlight was stumbling on things that I had no idea existed. One of them was going through a file which had been mislabeled, and opening it, and here was a letter that Nijinska wrote to this Soviet ballet historian, Vera Krasovskaya, in which she's describing in 10 pages the Rite of Spring and her role. And of course, she also says that, I don't really remember that much about it. It was 50 years ago. But, Krasovskaya was writing a book, which became ballet in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It's a 2-volume book, and she had a volume on choreographers, and she wanted information about Nijinsky. So she wrote this letter to Nijinska. It arrived, and the next day Nijinska, writes back to her. And this began a correspondence, a real epistolary friendship. I believe they met once in Paris, but essentially it was epistolary, and how they go from, the different nicknames and the other things. That was really one of the high points, I would say. and showed Nijinska's capacity for friendship with someone she regarded as her equal, who knew about ballet, but was an intellectual, who was curious. And of course, Nijinska had a lot of Russian books. Her books are all at the Library of Congress, but have never been cataloged. But I remember from when I was at the house, she had many Russian books. So she did keep up with as much as she could with what was being published about ballet and related arts and maybe some of the composers. There, so.
Thank you. The next question is from Lucia Cannon, who says, my grandmother's sister also studied in the Mariinsky Theater about that time. Do you know how many Polish girls studied there and its influence on the Polish ballet, or did they all become Russified?
I think there were a number of Polish children who were studying at the Imperial theaters. They all went to school in Russian. What seemed to differentiate the Polish children from the quote, Russian nationality children was where they took religious instruction. And so the Polish children would see a Catholic priest who presumably was Polish from time to time. Everyone else had Orthodox instruction. So yes, they were Russified to the extent that their written language and the language of school and the language of ballet, insofar as it wasn't French, was Russian. There were certain Polish teachers who taught at the Imperial school, like Stanislav Diaghilev was one. And there were, of course, families such as the Nijinsky family that where several members of the family were part of the imperial ballets, but essentially they were essentially Russified.
Thank you. One more from Mary Pat Kelly, who says, the prose is so good. Wondered if you could talk about your writing process, please.
My writing process is trying to get beyond the beginning. I'm someone who always has is much better at ending than beginning. So I never seem to have a problem about where to end. I mean, I may have to fuss a little bit. But beginnings I'm terrible. So I just have to plunge into it knowing that it's going to have to be rewritten and cut and condensed. I would say that I'm a very slow writer and a fairly meticulous one. I research I do a great deal of initial research, but then once I start writing, then the writing brings up other questions I have, and that's where I have to then do some other research. But very often I wouldn't have anticipated that because that came through the writing. So I think in part it's intuitive, but with a real bedrock of research. Yes.
Well, I mean, I think you would agree with the statement that Nijinska very much lived in a man's world, but she did
Yes.
often have, as you mentioned, very important relationships with other women artists,
Mhm.
sort of artists writ
Mhm.
large. Could you talk a little bit about her relationships with Goncharova and Exter?
I think Exter was one of had the most profound influence on her. Nijinska seems to have met her either in Petersburg or in Moscow when she saw some of the productions of that Exter had designed for Alexandra Exter's theater. And these designs were considered we're now talking 1916, 1917. And these designs were really totally different from designs that she had encountered with the Ballet Russe, and certainly at the Imperial theaters, where design was still relatively traditional. And I think that sort of opened her mind to a lot of, all kinds of possibilities in terms of abstraction, in terms of non-narrative forms, non-descriptive forms. And it's clear in some of her very earliest attempts at writing theoretically that her example is from the visual world. They didn't actually work together in Russia or Ukraine, because they both spent Nijinska was in Ukraine continuously from 1918 to 21. Exter was there for a while, and then when the Soviets would come in, she'd go somewhere else. Then she'd come back when things changed. So they never actually worked together, but they worked together much later, and I think it was very harmonious. Natalia Goncharova, I don't think had as powerful as transformative an impact, but she loved Goncharova. I mean, they were just great friends. She thought she was so Russian. I mean, she said so, she was so Russian. And, and there are some portraits and things, there was a closeness there. But there were others who were, where I think she really became friends. There was this Polish visual artist who designed one of the most interesting things that she did for the Polish ballet. This was a kind of, what was the title of it? Legend of Krakow. And it was set in the Carpathian Mountains during the 16th century. And she forced the designer, who was this woman, to completely redo the designs because she said they weren't right. And the men blamed her, but the artist said later on, well, she was absolutely right. It was altogether wrong. She wanted it set in Poland. This was the Polish ballet, but the guy who had imagined the whole thing had said, oh no, it should just be in the Renaissance, like Romeo and Juliet or something. And there's been a lot of new writing about her, this artist, and with a number of photographs that I had never seen. And it's clear that they were friends, that there was some kind of friendship and some kind of real collaboration. But of course, it never went anywhere because this is 1937, 1938, 1939, Poland's invaded, and the war begins. So there are people she doesn't see then for years and years and years. But so there are any number of things. And what was there another kind of collaboration I would like to say is her collaboration with some of her women dancers, the ballerina muses. Now, ballerinas are often called muses, but I'm not sure that I see these as women of power, and that the way she was using technique was to empower them rather than make them bring out a kind of almost emotional vulnerability. In other words, I don't sense the kind of erotic impulse that I sense in Balanchine's treat, because Balanchine is usually the ones we talk about muses there. I mean, I never used the word muses until much later on when I was, really thinking about her relationship with some of these others.
I have a question. You talked so eloquently about these significant omissions of Nijinska's presence in the ballet history. So what do we gain by reinserting her in this narrative? So in other words, how do you see, in a nutshell, your contribution to what we know about ballet history through this book?
One of the things I think is just to realize that first of all, that there is choreography by women in ballet that has gone on in a sense all the time. However, there are in a sense, almost semi-visible or mostly invisible, semi-visible practices, which are not necessarily recognized. What is clear about Nijinska is she slips back and forth between semi-visible and visible practices, practices that become part of what you might call a kind of trunk line of ballet history, 20th century ballet history. But she's not always there. I also think following her career shows you the really broad number of women who were choreographers working in the ballet world who are just barely acknowledged. I mean, even maybe there'll be a name somewhere, but there's virtually no writing about many of them. And it also, I mean, this was another thing that surprised me again and again, the number of female critics that I was coming across, the number of women who were, doing all kinds of things, maybe scene painting, producing things. In other words, that women were present in many parts of the ballet world, even though they weren't maybe anthologized or their works weren't necessarily circulating that broadly. And it also calls into question certain writers. For instance, Agnes de Mille is a very, very well-known writer about dance and about ballet. She herself was a writer was a choreographer. She did a number of ballets. And I was moving along with the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo, 1942, and I realized, this is when Nijinska is doing Chopin Concerto. She's bringing it back. There's Rodeo, which Agnes de Mille is doing, and there was someone else from the company was doing a ballet. So there was a program with all three ballets by women. This was noted by John Martin. It was noted by some other critics, women critics noted this. In Agnes de Mille's autobiography, where she's constantly talking about her problems with with Uncle Cecil de Mille and all of this male world which is against her on Broadway, etc. Does she ever mention this? No, she has a long chapter about the choreography of Rodeo and all the problems she had with the Russians, blah, blah, blah. She doesn't mention that there were any other women contributing to the season. And that has become that's sort of a foundational work, if you will, to kind of dance history of that particular a memoir of that particular moment. I myself used to use it. Did not realize that there were all female programs during that period because I was relying on Agnes de Mille. So maybe some of our writers, including some women writers, are not necessarily everything to be believed. But I came to really appreciate someone like Claudia Cassidy, who was the music and dance critic for the Chicago Tribune, the Tribune. And she was a wonderful critic. She was very lively and she saw quite a lot and she was enthusiastic. She was sharp. She would do interviews. She would do, as well as just criticism. There was another one out in California who, for the LA Times, who used to do a lot of more general arts criticism. So there were these voices and, one doesn't, but they didn't necessarily write for places that they were not anthologized. In fact, it was only because of ProQuest that some of these voices have become accessible. But for instance, Anne Barzell, who was a very prominent dance critic throughout the 1940s and 50s, she was Chicago-based and wrote for Dance News on a regular basis, Dance Magazine, but these have not been digitized. So, they in a sense are in this limbo of existence only for people who are doing the primary research, but they're not easily accessible.
We have two more questions from our online audience. Catherine Tech is asking, did you ever meet or see Nijinska in person?
No, I never saw, I knew her daughter, who used to sometimes wear her mother's clothing. Including this one black velvet dress, you know, for an opening or some, you know, the opening dress, but yes. So I knew her daughter, Irina, but I did not know Nijinska herself. And I also knew her granddaughter, Irina's daughter, who alas has passed far too early, and who was very interested in her grandmother's work.
Lucia Cannon is asking, did she know Tamara Dylan in Paris or in St. Petersburg? They have similar backgrounds in many respects.
No, I don't think so. I've never come across anything connecting them. But it's not to say they didn't know, that they had never met, but they would have seemed to travel in different, in quite different circles. Also, one of the things about Nijinska's career is because it was so transnational, she traveled a lot. When she went to Buenos Aires, it wasn't like she just flew off for 2 weeks. She would take a 10-day trip, you know, by boat. Maybe it was 2 weeks. And then she was basically away for 9 months of the year. So she was in charge of an entire season, if you will. So she was in Paris, but she, you know, Paris in a sense is her headquarters from 1925 on until, but very often she was someplace else.
You mentioned that the Library of Congress Nijinska collection is still not fully cataloged, but I'm wondering what is the state of the collection? What was your role in getting it processed, or I don't know, how were you able to utilize it when it's just so much, but not?
No, by the time I got to it, there had been someone who'd gone through and made some kind of finding aid. The finding aid was not that accurate. There was someone who was helping me first. She was doing some refining, but there was a point at which they would not, basically they wouldn't hire a Russian reading, Russian reading archivist who could also handle a lot of French and maybe German. They just didn't do it. They had them for music. That's what infuriated me. But they did not have one. They wouldn't hire someone, say for a 1-year contract or something, to do it for dance. And so there is a finding aid, a revised finding aid. It was revived about 10 years ago. And I've actually, I have a PDF of it, and I send it to people who have any questions about what's in the collection, because I feel like Johnny Appleseed that way, you know, circulating this. But otherwise, there are things that have to be finalized, and people have been tempted to explain this to me, but perhaps I willfully misunderstand. But it just seems to me, which is why it's not online, which is where it should be.
And then you said that the books were not cataloged.
They never cataloged the books.
Not even a listing?
Not even a listing.
Oh, that's ridiculous.
Yeah. Because that would, of course, give you a sense of her, you know, of her reading. I don't even know where the books are, but my understanding was that the books were there. As I say, some of the things are quite interesting. Like she very early on had a copy of Tyliakovsky's diary. Tyliakovsky was the last, head of the Imperial Theater, director of the Imperial Theaters. And he had voluminous diaries, which are now being published pretty much in their entirety. But early in the Soviet period, they had published excerpts from the diaries that had to do with the revolution of 1905, that moment. And she had that, you know, so as I say, she collected Russian, you know, Soviet books as much as she, you know, she could get them. So I can't explain it why they don't do it, but it would certainly give, it would be a guide to how she thought.
I think we should give Lynn, oh,
Last question. What is your next project?
My next project is a short biography of Arthur Mitchell for the Black Lives series published by Yale University Press. As some of you know, I did I curated an exhibition at Columbia's Wallach Gallery. I guess Jenny, when was that? In 2018? 2018, shortly before he passed. And it's came up and it just seemed about the right. I still have a number of things I want to say about him that I wasn't able to get into the exhibition or the timeline or into the website. So that's my next project. So it's going to be very short.
we'll look forward to celebrating that. Thank you so much for a wonderful window toward a fascinating world. And thank you for enriching not just the classic line of ballet history, but all these peripheral stories.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to thank the Harriman. I want to thank Kathy Nepomniachtchi, who is no longer with us, but is somewhere, and who involved me in the Harriman and really encouraged me to, you know, not fear going into more deeply into certain things that perhaps I was a little loath to do. So thank you.
It's our pleasure to have you here again.